Thank you, Mr. Chairman, sir. Mr. Chairman, sir, what does the Aam Aadmi look for in a budget? At the personal level, he would obviously like more income, lower costs. At the broader level, he would like policies that will increase his job opportunities, reduce the prices he has to pay for daily essentials, and widen his life prospects. What does the economist look for? At the macro level, policies that will create growth and jobs, improve exports, promote economic stability, tackle inflation, and still help the government keep its fiscal deficit under control. What does the politician look for? Sops that he can sell to the voters. This budget, Mr. Chairman, has much to disappoint the Aam Aadmi, frustrate the economist, and prove a mixed bag for the politician. Now, any budget must address 5 issues. 1, fiscal consolidation, that is a policy aimed at reducing the fiscal deficit. 2, job creation, usually through boosting manufacturing. 3, increasing savings in order to boost investments. 4, inflation control in our country, that's obvious. And 5, improving investor sentiment, both domestic and foreign, so we can promote growth. I'm sorry to say, Mr. Chairman, this budget falls short on all these 5 criteria. Yes, it's a political budget. The government has at last discovered the virtues of attending to the needs of the agriculture sector and the rural poor. But this has much more to do with the upcoming state elections than with a coherent economic vision. This budget falls between 2 stools, Mr. Chairman, between sending reassuring signals to the ratings agencies abroad and sending even more reassuring signals to the voters at home. In other words, it tries to satisfy both Modi's interests and Moody's interests. Nowhere is this contradiction more apparent than in the unreality of some of the government's numbers, especially a 3.5% fiscal deficit, where it's very clear from the budget there will be unplanned expenses and unrealized revenue. The Finance Minister knows that he must fund expenditure for rural development, farmer welfare, housing for all, sanitation projects, grant of one rank, one pension, recapitalization of stressed public sector banks, and he also has to eventually accommodate expenditure of 0.65% of GDP for the 7th Pay Commission recommendations, and a further set of investments of about 2% of GDP to fund massive infrastructure projects. And what about the additional expenses for implementing the National Food Security Act? This exhaustive shopping list is certainly going to oblige the NDA government to breach Mr. Jaitley's commitments of a fiscal deficit of 3.5. More so because the tax collection targets are going to be very difficult to meet. The revenue expenditure balance sheet is not encouraging. In addition, the disinvestment targets mentioned by the Minister in previous budgets have been completely missed by the government. But the Finance Minister is still optimistic because he has budgeted 12.74% increase in the next net tax revenue collections for next year. Now, these rely heavily on indirect taxation, which already grew by 34.8% last year, and they rely on multiple hikes on excise duties, even as oil prices fall, which brings, of course, unpleasant news for every middle-class and lower-middle-class tax-paying citizen. Now, any economist will tell you that indirect taxes are essentially regressive. They hurt the poor more because the poor and the rich alike both have to pay more for the same essential services. A rich man's buying petrol for his stretch limousine, or a poor man is buying petrol for a scooter, they're paying the same price. So the government has been meeting its fiscal deficit targets on the backs of the Aam Aadmi instead of boosting the real incomes of the poor by cutting indirect taxes. So oil prices drop, excise duties go up, the Aam Aadmi in India gets no benefits, while people in the rest of the world are saving at the petrol pump. No wonder this fiscal year the centre was able to rake in 54,334 crores over the estimates for the union excise duties, and has also increased its estimate for the year by 27% to 3.18 lakh crores. जैसे गालिब शायद लिख सकता था, हजारों ख्वाहिशों ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, हजारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, हम चले थे सस्ता पेट्रोल लेने, लौटे टैक्स का बोझ लिए। पिछले साल आपने तो सर्विस टैक्स 12% से 14% तक कर दिया था। उसके बाद 0.5% स्वच्छ भारत सेस भी लागू किया और इस साल 0.5% कृषि कल्याण सेस लगा दिया है। इस पे मैं शायद कोई और शायरी सुनाऊं आपको। अलविदा कहते हुए जब मैंने इस शख्स से पूछा कि कोई निशानी तो दो, अलविदा कहते हुए जब मैं इस शख्स से पूछा कि कोई निशानी तो दो, वो मुस्कुराते हुए बोले 15% सर्विस टैक्स ले लो। बिल्कुल, और भी सुनाऊंगा। On top of that, Mr. Chairman, the recent Paris commitments create an onus to encourage sustainable and eco-friendly consumption habits. And yet the minister goes and levies 1% infrastructure cess on small LPG and CNG cars. That defeats the very objective of the commitment that his colleague has made in Paris. The tax exemptions on profits for startups is a far cry from the much-needed rationalization of a tax on angel investors. In fact, because most startups, let's face it, don't actually book profits in the first few years of their operation. So telling them you don't have to pay tax on profits makes no difference. They don't have profits anyway at the beginning. What you really need is to give angel investments, which are the bread and butter of these cash-starved startups, and give them a removal of the angel tax, which would have actually strengthened the startup ecosystem. But that's not all, Mr. Chairman. Corporates hoping for tax cuts, that never happened. And where is the proposed timetable for a rollout of the direct taxes code? तो एक और शायरी सुनाऊंगा, आपने अगर चाहते हैं तो। कितना खौफ होता है बजट के उस ब्रीफकेस में, कितना खौफ होता है बजट के उस ब्रीफकेस में, पूछ उन परिंदों से जो टैक्स रिफॉर्म की आशा पे उड़ते फिरते थे। अच्छा, मैं केरला से होते हुए भी एक हिंदी मुहावरा जानता हूं कि घर की मुर्गी दाल बराबर। लेकिन आजकल इन सरकार की वजह से महंगाई इतनी बढ़ गई है कि घर की दाल भी मुर्गी बराबर हो गया। अच्छा, एक और उदाहरण दे दूं। If a middle class family of 4 in Delhi wants to go to a restaurant, they would have to incur the following expenses: 5 litres of petrol on average, given our distances and traffic, at 56.61 rupees per litre, which would cost them 283 rupees, which includes a tax of 190 rupees, 204% more than the global oil price. Then let's give them a nominal restaurant bill of just 1,000 rupees, बहुत सस्ते खा लिए, which would attract a tax of 303.50 paise, service tax of 10% VAT of 12.5%, service tax of 14%, service charge of 10%, VAT of 12.5%, service tax of 14%, plus Swachh Bharat cess of 0.5%, plus Krishi Kalyan cess of 0.5%, collectively levied on 40% of the bill. In other words, for this poor family, this middle-class family to go to a restaurant in Delhi, a person would have to earn 2,240 rupees and, of course, pay a tax of 660 rupees on the income. And therefore, from that income of 2,240, this person would spend 1,087 on the actual value of the consumed, and 1,153 or 51.5% as tax. In other words, your tax costs more than your dinner, even your transport. Now, this increase has really troubled the middle class in our country. And I must say, the increase in power prices have also accepted the budget of every family. In fact, in many cases, the electricity bill has doubled thanks to the budget announcements of our government. मत पूछ कि क्या हाल है मेरा इस साल के बजट के बाद, मत पूछ कि क्या हाल है मेरा इस साल के बजट के बाद, आजकल फोन की टॉर्च से घर रोशन क्या करते हैं। Now, in a bid to achieve its ambitious GDP growth figures, the government has therefore burdened the Aam Aadmi. That is my principal point here. But has the finance minister done enough to stimulate growth in the coming year and beyond? I'm afraid not. it does seem that he's made a conscious decision to tone down previous year's growth aspirations. Given the sluggish environment of investment, there's a need for both enhancing public investment in social and physical infrastructure and also undertaking innovative measures to stimulate private investment, because private investment is largely not happening. There simply isn't enough in the budget on either count. As for the government's optimistic estimates of growth, I must point out, Mr. Chairman, that normally growth implies that production, profits, wages, jobs and exports are all growing. That's what we understand by growth. Here we have a peculiar situation where none of these elements is growing. Production isn't growing, profits aren't growing, wages aren't growing, jobs aren't growing and exports aren't growing. So how do we still have the government projecting a 7% GDP growth? At present, the external debt of the country is already at an all-time high of 31.7 lakh crores, a number the finance minister carefully did not mention in his presentation. And growth has slowed in all the key sectors in 2015-16. Slowed in manufacturing, in construction, in mining, in industries, in electricity and in agriculture. The index of industrial production is in the red, minus 1.3% in December. And this is as compared with 3.6% in December 2014. Corporate sector profitability has been weak, and the proportion of corporate debt that's owned by stressed companies has increased to 41% this year from 35% in 2014. So I only hope, Jaitley Sahab, that unlike the black money estimates floated by the ruling party, you're not getting your economics from Baba Ramdev. The black into white scheme of the government has identified only 3,770 crores of undisclosed foreign assets, which boils down to about 30 rupees for every Indian instead of the 15 lakhs per person promised to us. But of course we have been informed by a senior leader of the BJP that this is only a jumla, we shouldn't take this figure too seriously. Now, whatever it may be, the tough truth is that the official GDP data, it may well be accurate, but it does not reflect the actual state of the Indian economy today. And what is worse is what lies ahead, which is that the battle is with a volatile global economy, declining exports, possible increase in oil prices from the anticipated $35 a barrel at which the budget has been pitched, the risk of a poor monsoon and static domestic consumption. Let's face it, monetary institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have already lowered their estimates for global economic growth, and they have to take into account the slowdown in China, the declining oil and commodity prices, ongoing geopolitical tensions in many regions, particularly the Middle East, which will affect trade, which will divert funds from infrastructure and development needs. So, for us in India, it is a long-established principle that 1 percentage point decrease in global economic growth normally translates into a 0.42% decrease in our domestic growth. This is a rough rule of thumb. I don't know if the Minister has a different yardstick. But we are facing, therefore, some of the backwash from global declining growth. On top of that, declining exports are a fact. For 2 consecutive years, our exports have gone down. Now, what is curious, sir, is that world trade has actually gone up by a modest 3%. But how can we profit from that increase in world trade when our own exports have actually shown negative growth? So clearly, global markets are not as ready for Indian goods and services as we would like to believe. We've had the Make in India slogan going around for a while, but it looks like if we don't increase domestic consumption, we're not going to push up our growth rates because foreigners aren't buying our goods. Now, obviously, the monsoon is something that we are all praying for, that it will be good for the farmers. But the truth of the matter is, again, that the El Nino effect last year took away 0.7 percentage points from our GDP growth. And this year, the government, in its optimism, has clearly overlooked the warnings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about the adverse and continuing impact of climate change on rainfall. I certainly wish our Finance Minister luck in reversing the climate change forecast within a few months and inducing a favourable monsoon to improve the rural economy. But what happens if it doesn't happen? What happens if we don't have a favourable monsoon? Where do these numbers go? But to return to the government's numbers on disinvestment, the government managed to raise, last year they announced a target of 69,500 crore for disinvestment. They raised only 25,312 crore. Okay, massive shortfall. Despite this dose of cold water from the markets, the government has again announced an ambitious target of 56,000 crore for the fiscal year 2016-17. Is this credible? Or is it an example of what one might call, with this very faith-based government, what one might call faith-based budgeting? Now, there are some positives, so I don't want to stand here and only say negatives about the budget. We welcome the increased allocations for Swachh Bharat. I may point out that so far the allocations of Swachh Bharat have been below the levels of the UPA sanitation budgets. But now it has gone up. Roads and highways, we know. Manrega, the finance minister said it was the highest ever allocation. It's not. It is still below the 2010-11 levels of the Manrega budget of UPA. Budget levels.
The UPA system of accounting was budget for 40,000, spend 29,000.
Actually spend, we will take that comparison. Right now you're comparing budget to budget.
Current year we've spent much higher. This is the first budget after a decade where the revised estimates are higher than the budget estimates.
So when we see you actually spending that money, we will accept your point with pleasure, Mr. Finance Minister. Gram Panchayat should get more money. We have been calling for that for years. We are pleased. LPG for cooking for poor rural women, that is a very important point. No one who has been to a village hut and seen these women struggling with the smoke from chulhas, from wood fires, coal fires, cow dung fires, can possibly disagree with the finance minister. LPG is wonderful. I only hope the government's policies leave these poor women and their families enough money so they can have something to cook with the LPG. That is the big anxiety we have. And I also hope, of course, that the government will find the money to fulfill all the promises that I have just summarized. Certainly the urban component of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan didn't exist in last year's budget. It will strengthen, I believe, drainage and sewerage systems of the cities. I'm only sorry that it took the Chennai floods to clear the haze off the eyes of the government and put this very valuable new idea in. And as a member of the previous government, I couldn't help feeling vindicated to see the government embracing UPA ideas that it had earlier bitterly opposed, from strengthening the Aadhaar platform to Manrega itself, to welcoming 100% FDI in food processing. And I'm very glad that the government has seen the error of its ways in withdrawing the proposal to tax EPF. This was an unwelcome proposal which really overlooked the reality of why middle-class people actually withdraw their money from the Provident Fund. They do it for expenses, not to create new annuities. So I'm glad the government has withdrawn the proposal. And if I can look at all this list of UPA achievements and their actions, I can certainly quote another poet. Nazar ko badlo to nazare badal jate hain. Soch ko badlo to sitare badal jate hain. Kashtiyan badalne ki zarurat nahi. Disha ko badlo to kinare khud badal jate hain. And that would be the right thing for the NDA to do, taking more of the very good ideas the UPA implemented over the last few years. Now, Mr. Jaitley has also increased the allocation for housing under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, but it's only 6.6% of the total estimate of 300,000 crore rupees, 3 lakh crore, which was required for the scheme, according to the government, over the next 7 years. And even more surprising, Mr. Chairman, it is lower than the 24,600 crore announced by the President, the Honourable President, in his address. So who is misleading the Parliament? Is it the Finance Minister or the Honourable President? One of them must be wrong, and the House needs to be told which number you are withdrawing. Similarly, the Honourable Prime Minister has announced a generous corpus of 10,000 crores for Startup India, Stand Up India at Vigyan Bhavan in January, but North Block has translated his promise of 10,000 crores into an allocation of 1,100 crores. So where is the remaining corpus for innovation and entrepreneurship? Are we again hearing announcements from the Prime Minister that the Finance Minister has no intention to fulfill? Many of Mr. Jaitley's budgetary cuts are a matter of grave concern. Food security is down by 5,000 crores. Fertilizer subsidies cut by 2,000 crores. Higher education, we had already objected last year when for 5 new IITs he had allotted 1,000 crores. We said by any yardstick, this is not enough. There are certain rules to be followed for how much it costs to set up an IIT. Now that same thing, and by the way, the one of them is in Kerala, so I have a strong interest in this, he has hacked the 5 IITs allotment to 190 crores this year. I mean, this is honestly laughable, Mr. Chairman. We can't take this figure seriously. You're not going to set up 1/8 of an IIT with 190 crores, let alone do it for 5 IITs. Ministry of Minority Affairs, cut. Ministry of Women and Child Development, cut again. The Nirbhaya has been reduced from 1,000 crores to just 500 crores, even though of the 31 sanctioned one-stop crisis centres, only 8 have become operational. The minister, not this minister, the Minister of Women and Child Development, had cited the Nirbhaya case when she talked about subjecting juveniles between 16 to 18 years of age to an adult correctional system, something I strongly objected to at the time, but she said it was necessary to protect women. And yet, this government has not done enough to set up facilities to assist victims of violence and rape. It's of course much easier to shrug off responsibility by holding children accountable. I'm sure that serves a very expedient political purpose, but there is no money to actually help the women, even for what has been pledged by this government in the last 2 years. Now, we have seen the merger of the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. I will not go into the substantive merits of that. My party has its own views that they will speak about. But the fact is, when you combine the 2 budgets of these 2 ministries of last year, and you see what the combined budget is this year, the Finance Ministry has cut 420 crores. So, the Prime Minister talks of the Indian diaspora, he addresses the Indian diaspora, he talks about how important it is to support the well-being of the Indian diaspora, but the funds allotted to their well-being have been cut by the Finance Ministry. As it is, as the Standing Committee on External Affairs has repeatedly pointed out, the Ministry of External Affairs is grossly underfunded. Now we see in this year's budget it's become worse. Development assistance for the SAARC countries have been cut. The allocation for Nepal has been reduced by 28.5%. Even though this is a country still recovering from a devastating earthquake, a terrible natural disaster, facing nationwide shortages. Now, I must say, I have really, having seen the way in which every request of the MEA is hacked by North Bloc, that the biggest challenge for Indian foreign policy is not Pakistan, sir, it's the Finance Ministry. Now, even the central plan outlay for the Ministry of Environment and Forests, including the National Afforestation Programme, has seen a budgetary cut of 66%. They had 1,446 crores in 2015-16. Now it's down to 480 crores. And that too just after the minister has gone and made these extravagant commitments at the climate summit in Paris. No additional funds appear to have been earmarked for the pledges made by India at COP21. One cannot even find the faintest mention of a reserve to start fulfilling a requirement of $2.5 trillion announced by the government of India for the Paris commitments over the next 15 years. Now, we're going to be spending $2.5 trillion over the next 15 years. You better start now. But the Finance Minister has not given 1 paise for these commitments. Let's face it, making promises with no intention to fulfill them is not exactly unfamiliar territory for this government. Too many promises from the previous budgets have not been executed or fulfilled. What happened to the Expenditure Reforms Commission announced in Mr. Jaitley's first budget speech? Never heard about it. What about last year's SETU, self-employment and talent utilisation?
They've submitted 3 reports.
You have not taken the House into confidence, sir.
Therefore, you should keep yourself informed.
Yes, you have not placed them in Parliament, Mr. Minister. So what happened to the self-employment and talent utilisation, or SETU, and the Atal Innovation Mission, or AIM, which were announced by great fanfare, by you last year, but were not funded or even mentioned by you this year? Anyway, let me as an MP from Kerala also point out that despite the state government of Kerala submitting its final logistics, funds have not been found yet for an All India Institute of Medical Sciences in my state. The promise made by, if not this minister, another minister, I cannot remember immediately off the top of my head, to declare Sabrimala as a national pilgrimage centre with extra resources to boost tourism remains unfulfilled. Where is the promised corpus for rubber farmers, assistance for economically vulnerable immigrants returning from the Gulf countries? None of these commitments are mentioned in the budget. My own request for establishing a National Institute of Medicinal Plants in Trivandrum has been overlooked, a national centre for Ayurveda, despite the government's declared desire to promote Ayurveda, for which it even constituted a separate ministry. It has failed to harness Kerala's potential in traditional knowledge and Ayurvedic medicines and herbs. But that is perhaps seen as a parochial point. I'm sure as one state has concerns, every state has concerns, Mr. Chairman. And the government's implementation rate of its previous promises is not encouraging. Last year, Mr. Jaitley promised that 6 crore toilets would be built. The actual achievement is barely 10%, 62 lakh toilets. And not all of those have water or electricity. The government should have completed the mammoth task of laying pipes for water supply for more than 60% of rural households that don't have piped water. While 5,000 crores for 2016 is a bit of an increase from last year's allocation for water supply, it is much less than the 11,000 crores allocated by the UPA in 2013. I know this is a leap year budget, clearly because it requires a leap of faith to trust the BJP's numbers. The Finance Minister also missed an opportunity to devote more resources in a targeted way to something that his colleagues have trumpeted repeatedly in this House, the need to install broadband and increase internet speed in both rural and urban areas. The National Optical Fibre Network is far behind its intended coverage of 250,000, 2 lakh and a half gram panchayats. They've only reached 40,000 gram panchayats. The only progress has been in renaming the scheme as BharatNet. We often said this is not a game-changing government, it's a name-changing government. Sare naam badal diye. New deadlines. But they've also given a 300% increase in the project cost, which they have not funded in this budget. Now, I don't know if the Prime Minister actually intended to include rural India in his vision for digitization through public Wi-Fi hotspots, e-books, online medical consultations, medicine supplies. He mentioned all this in Parliament: mobile banking, e-courts, e-police. But with 70% of our rural households operating without the internet, mobile phones that don't have internet connectivity, how can they access any of these services? How will you have the direct benefit transfers that the Minister has been proudly talking about, the so-called jam trinity? I mean, this may be jam in the urban areas, there's no jam in the rural areas, because only 27% of villagers in our country have a bank within a radius of 5 kilometers. And of course, all the online services the government wants to bring on stream, if you have poor internet speed, and India is struggling today with a connection speed of 2.3 Mbps, when the global average is 5 Mbps or more, how are we going to be able to deliver these services? And then many of the promises are not new. Even though the government has budgeted an increase in the allocation for central plans for agriculture, including this newly named Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, it is still lower than the 19,047 crores allotted by the UPA in the last fiscal year 2014 of our budget. At that time already the UPA had provided for weather-based crop insurance, agriculture insurance, Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana and National Culture Mission. Clearly there is nothing for farmer welfare that was not already provided for earlier. In fact, the NDA reduced the UPA's allocations last year and have then increased it this year. So they have gone down, they are now atoning for their mistake by raising the budget. Plagiarism is, of course, the sincerest form of flattery. Interest subsidy subvention was also in the UPA budget, exactly. Anyway, the fact is, insurance schemes are all very well, but they are not a credible substitute for the missing capital expenditure on agriculture, which alone can help pull farmers out of distress. And I might say, Jaitley Sahab, this is the first time in living memory, I have asked many senior colleagues who have been here longer, that a finance minister has not even mentioned the defence allocation in the entire current fiscal year in his speech. Some of the budget's other omissions are also interesting. The government has raised taxes on tobacco products, saying it causes cancer, but not BDs. So is it signalling that it's okay for the poor BD smoker to die of cancer, but the rich middle class and upper middle class cigarette smoker must stay alive, so we must tax him? And what about social sector spending? According to the latest World Development Indicators data, public spending on health and education is just 4.7% of GDP in India, compared with 7% in sub-Saharan Africa. People think sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world. They're spending 7% on health and education, we're spending 4.7%. East Asia 7.2%, Latin America 8.5%, and the rich OECD countries 13.3%. So it's not a question of wealth or the amounts of money you're spending, it's the percentage. What priority are you giving it? And frankly, if you take the entire basket of least developed countries, the figure for least developed countries is 6.4%, and we are only spending 4.2%. Let me take education. This year's allocation for the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan falls beyond whatever numbers they've come up with, but below the UPA's allocation of 26,608 crores in our last year. Public spending on education is not only inadequate, it is underutilized. Only 57% of the estimates were released last year. So Jaitley Sahab was speaking about expenditure as opposed to budget estimates, but on education only 57% of his own estimates were spent.
But Narega he told. But not education.
Not education. Only 1/4 of the amount was spent in the first few months of the year, and quality of education has been suffering, Mr. Chairman. Now, the Prime Minister said that he saw this budget as an examination. In this case, his report card will have to say, must try harder. Now, enrollment in schools is not the only thing. We must have much more academic freedom. Yes, sir. I need 3-4 minutes to wrap up. I've just got to education. The fact is that at a time when independent thought, uninhibited deliberation, right to dissent in educational institutions are under threat, if you also starve them of money, how are we going to get better, well-informed citizens of modern India to serve our nation? That was education. Health, sir. If you look at the fact we need a colossal amount of money in order to achieve anything remotely like the declared objective of universal health coverage by 2030, the fact is the public health system is in pretty bad shape. The government has taken so long to deliberate on the national health policy, but the budget for the transport ministry is 2.6 times the budget of the health ministry. Even customs duty exemptions on 76 life-saving drugs, cancer drugs, HIV drugs have been withdrawn by this budget, Mr. Chairman.
Very safe.
And welfare measures for people with disabilities. It's particularly sad that they have raised the budget, but there's no comprehensive legislation yet to guide the expenditure that they have raised in a futile manner, because there is no disabilities law. It's been pending for 2 years in this government. We must have a disabilities law in consonance with the international standards before we can usefully and effectively spend this money. Funds needed to spur infrastructure growth, as I mentioned at the beginning, down by 12% this year, 2.21 lakh this year, it was 2.51 lakh crores last year. What about the money for addressing the banking sector's problems? At least the finance minister could have offered us a roadmap for how he intends to recapitalize public banks with an allocation of 25,000 crores. In fact, we all know there are so many non-performing assets, Mr. Chairman, it's been mentioned, and 3.6 lakh crores of non-performing assets. The banks are unable to fund long-term infrastructure projects, so many of which are stuck in the implementation stage. Mr. Jaitley, of course, will call it a legacy of the past, but it's his government that failed to acknowledge the crisis in 2014 and resolve it as per the Reserve Bank of India's recommendations on revitalization of distressed assets that year. Manufacturing. The fact is it's down. For manufacturing to be internationally competitive, you require policies that will reduce the cost of manufacturing, affordable interest rates, improved infrastructure, better trade facilitation, lower cost of power, in other words, an entire ecosystem. Just having a slogan saying Make in India won't do it, sir. You need all of these, and the Make in India budget in any case has been cut by 35%. Job creation, sir, 17.5 million people have found themselves unemployed under the BJP. The labour force participation rate has been going down. I have a former labour minister sitting in front of me. It's now as low as 47.2% in rural areas and only 54% in urban areas. Another 30 million will enter the workforce in the remainder of Mr. Modi's term. What work will this budget help them find? The female participation rate, by the way, is even lower, 30%. Are there any targeted measures to help females work? Wage demands of the organised sector are not being, Mr. Chairman. I have received a delegation of nurses, for example. The wage demands of our staff nurses are low even in the 7th Pay Commission. And without satisfied nurses, how will our healthcare system function effectively? Pradhan Mantri man ki baat karte hain, Vitt Mantri dhan ki baat karte hain, lekin kabhi bhi is sarkar jan ki baat कब करेगी? Finally, sir, last point, we must ensure that this government is held to the last of its earlier commitments. The budget has confirmed the fears of many foreign observers that this government is not going to make any significant institutional reforms. What will be the effect of all this on the rupee? During the election campaign, Mr. Modi was withering about the decline in the value of the rupee, but it's fallen 16.5% on his watch. It was 58.50 when he became PM. He talked about it crossing the finance minister's age. Well, now it's overtaken his age. And having plumbed the debts of 68.85, even though it's slightly better at 67.41 today, the overall trend is that it seems to be well on the way to crossing all numbers and joining the BJP's Marg Darshak Mandal. You know, sir, the budget, the last budget of the UPA, Mr. Modi wrote an article in the Economic Times. And he wrote saying this budget is piecemeal, UPA wants to play safe. He had repeatedly mocked the UPA for not thinking big. It's all the more disappointing that this budget has also failed to think big, tried to play it safe, and approach the country's economic challenges piecemeal. The joke going around is that this is a good budget only for the Aadhaar card holding BD smoker in need of dialysis, who lost his degree certificate and plans to launch a loss-making startup in a Gram Panchayat with Winrega funds. For everybody else, it's a huge disappointment. As Ghalib has observed, this time it's really him and not my version of Ghalib. बुझ जाते हैं दिए कभी तेल की कमी से भी हर बार कसूर हवा के झोंकों का नहीं होता. This is what has happened to our country. कसूर किसी और का नहीं है भाई साहब, आपकी सरकार में ही तेल की कमी है. जय हिंद, Mr. Chairman.